So I guess I'm very bad in timing, but I'll, okay, sorry, just two more people. Hello, welcome. Okay, so I'll try to begin while also being the host, and I hope I don't miss out anyone. So welcome. Welcome to this two-day conference on text and TECHNE. It's really a pleasure to see so many people, and I know that we are all scattered around different countries and different time zones and all the challenges that comes with it. And I'm really delighted to be here together and to hear all the presentations and papers that will be delivered in these 2 days. There are also going to be two keynotes and some special sessions as well. So I know that the program is rich, but I also know that because of the difference in time zones, not everyone will be able to attend live all the sessions. But for this reason, I'm trying to keep track also of the recording, and all sessions and all papers, including the keynotes and the special sessions, will be available on the conference websites after the conference. So if you feel that you missed out a session or you would like to hear again a particular paper, that is going to be possible. And I would like to do some official thanks to the institutions that allowed this conference to take place. First of all, the Trinity College Dublin, where I'm currently affiliated, thanks to a postdoctoral fellowship of the Irish Research Council, which I would like to thank as well. And then I would like to thank also the Interdisciplinary Italy Network and the International Society for Intermediate Studies. I know that there are going to be several papers engaging from an intermediate perspective and intermediality within textiles and poetry, whatever poetry means. So I'm very grateful for their support. And the conference is going to begin, just to give a brief overview of what we're going to do in these 2 days. It's going to begin with a keynote by Jessica Hemmings, which I'm sure will not need an introduction. And then there are going to be a couple of panels. The first panel is entitled Weaving Languages and Writing Textiles. And we have 4 brilliant papers that I very much look forward to listening. And then there is going to be a short break, half an hour. This might be morning, afternoon, I'm not sure, but hopefully a good break to rest a little bit before joining the second panel, which is on subversive needlework. And again, we're going to have 4 papers, and each panel will have these 4 papers and then time for a rich Q&A that is going to last between half an hour and 45 minutes. So we'll have plenty of time to talk together about the papers. And then we're going to have the third panel, which is entitled Performing and Exhibiting Textiles. And I then will let you rest a little bit before joining again for the last session of this first day, which is going to be a special session with Alison Parish, which is going to connect from New York. And tomorrow we are going to begin with the panel, the number 4, panel 4 on memory threads. And then there's going to be, after the break, the second keynote lecture by the artist Ann Wilson, which is going to join us from the US. So it's going to be very early in the morning for us in sort of continental Europe lunchtime. And we're going then to have our last panel on textile metaphors. And I then will happily sort of end this amazing and very rich program with a special session led by Amy Elkins. Perhaps you heard of her very recent book, Craft Feminism, with Oxford University Press, which I very much enjoyed, and I'm very grateful for her contribution to the conference. And I think that that's sort of that's it in terms of program, but I'm sure that we'll have glitches in the program, which are very welcome, interruptions, and hopefully no Zoom issues. I think that by now we are all a little bit pro with Zoom, but if you don't mind, I'll be annoying a little bit, just a couple of practicalities, which I'm sure are not new. I'll keep myself muted while other people talk, and I would sort of encourage everyone to do so. For the Q&A, and or if there is any sort of issues, please feel free to use the chat directly with me. I will have an eye on emails, but if you have something urgent, it's best the chat, just because I'll not be on emails all the time during the conference. And please do feel free to ask questions, comments, and thoughts either through the chat or just unmute yourself and ask it yourself. I think that that's it. I don't know if you have any questions at all, any thoughts before we begin. Then I'll take this chance to let the remaining people in. And I just wanted to say that I'm just so happy that already in the very, very first session, we are over 30 people. And I know that, I mean, just a personal note, as you know, I'm coming from sort of literary studies and comparative literature and Italian studies. And it's so great to being able to sort of create a space where people from different disciplines and different methodologies and are sort of joining in. So thank you. And I think that it's time to introduce very, very briefly someone who needs no introduction, Jessica Hemmings. Thank you for opening this conference with your keynote. And I, again, if I can, just because I think that you don't need an official introduction, I just would like to say a personal note that for me, the work and my engagement with textiles is rather recent. I'm talking about the last 5 years. And I remember that the very, very first encounter with scholarly thinking and reflections around textiles was through Jessica Hemmings' work. So it's I'm a little bit emotional to have you here. And I kept reading your work, and also I mean, the greatness around Jessica Hemmings is also the sort of the opportunity to collect other people's together through, for instance, the Textile Reader, which is now available through a new edition. And so also being able to create this cohort for us, and especially for a sort of a space around textiles that is often scattered around different places. So I think that that takes an even higher level of challenge. So thank you, Jessica, and welcome. And I think that even if we are 4 minutes earlier compared to the program, I'm sure that we'll keep up with a little bit of delays. So please feel free to start whenever you want. And thank you.
Thank you so much for that kind and a rather overwhelming introduction. I feel now that I'm stepping up to a high bar first thing, but thank you. I think maybe that many of us that work in relatively small disciplines often work away at our interests, wondering how many other people actually share them or are interested. So it's lovely to know that sometimes it does reach others, even if our communities are maybe relatively small compared to other academic disciplines. It was with considerable excitement that I accepted this invitation, because something that I have felt has been a bit of a long-standing but very personal interest of mine, to find that there would be a whole collection of people and a 2-day packed conference schedule around this theme is an inspiration to me as well. For those of you that don't know my background, and it might just help a little bit to explain that I studied woven textile design in the US at RISD. I was a very happy student of weaving. But I, after that BA degree, I studied comparative literature and ended up writing a PhD on a Zimbabwean author who sadly is no longer alive, but Yvonne Vera, very much looking at the way that she used textiles in her writing. I felt to be able to express things that would otherwise have been very difficult to communicate under Mugabe's regime in Zimbabwe, probably Zimbabwe today as well, in part because she had a government job as a director of the National Gallery of Bulawayo, so a government paycheck, and at the same time writing material that was sometimes politically critical of very sensitive topics. And since then, I have moved back and forth. I've looked for stories on cloth, and I've looked for cloth in stories, and it's just a loop that continues completely to consume me and fascinate me. Maybe I don't, in front of you, have to justify that so much. I think I'm maybe with a shared community here, but it is something that I flip-flop back and forth between, and maybe I'll do a little bit of that in this talk today, looking at the cloth for the stories that it is telling us. And as I said, always also tracing these why these textiles are present in certain types of literature. It's something that excites me from a literary perspective, because unlike maybe the work that I do, I'm a professor of craft. I assume that means I'm meant to explain to the world why these things are useful and important in today's society. When poetry is not my strength, but when poets or novelists take to the textile, use the textile in their writing, it's not with any of the academic agenda that I'm burdened with, or I burden myself with, maybe I should say. It's because they're so expressive. And so there's a certain freedom, I think, to that it just proves the reason to be so fascinated by these things. So that's a little framing of where I come from. And now I have to also offer a caveat or an apology that I have had a drift since I wrote my abstract. So some things have swapped around, and this is an incredibly new piece of thinking that I'm doing, which is a little bit off kilter, but please bear with me. I hope it might set the eclectic tone for these next 2 days, which I think the program is already pointing to as well. So I hope at a minimum you might find some humor in the oddities that I've dug up for us to look at in this opening session. I won't say this morning, but this opening session. I'll share my screen now if we can move on. And now, why can I not see where has my, there we go. No. Why does everyone have to have such clumsy fingers in front of an audience? I apologize. I can usually do better than this. Okay, here we are. I should also say I very much welcome questions and conversation at the end, and if we run out of time, then please feel free to contact me through email or another way. And I'm happy also to share this information afterwards. So please don't feel like you have to sort of grab notes and scribble down everything. You're very welcome to simply contact me and say, you know, what was that slide that you were referring to, and we can go back to it. I maybe should also explain that another entry point for me into this rather odd area of interest that I'm enjoying myself in at the moment is a fellowship I've held for the last couple of years at the Center for Material Culture in the Netherlands, where I've been looking at specifically at batik in their archive. I lived in Indonesia as a child, and I think it certainly was a point of great exposure for me to not only textiles, but of course a much more international interest in the world that we live in. And I have the batik that I chose to focus on last year as I was working in the archive. I've come to understand that it was produced by prisoners, female prisoners, on the island of Java at the turn of the last century, under Dutch guidance, Dutch leadership, which is something I very much query, because I wonder who needed to be teaching who in that context. But it's led me to this train of thinking about empowerment and oppression in textile labor, and the very fine line sometimes that we feel between these things. And the prison context, of course, I think is a very complicated example of that, in a context where I am still trying to understand how much choice would have been possible with that labor. But for this invitation, I started to think about how that might also play out in other examples, some of which I've sort of kept in my memory bank of examples that I return to again and again, because I think that they're so rich, and some newer material. So as I said, this is something that I often do and does annoy some of my colleagues. This is incredibly eclectic. We're going to spin around the world. And although I've called this Rehearsing Our Futures, and I will eventually get there, I will start in the past. So I've got, I believe, five examples for those of you that are trying to measure your coffee drinking along the way. So I think immediately back to the Scarlet Letter when I'm playing with this idea of empowerment and oppression in textile work. To show you the Scarlet Letter, of course, I dug up these some really rather dubious book cover designs, but a novel published by Hawthorne in 1850, but sent about that much time earlier. So he's writing of a time much earlier than he's publishing. One of the earliest mass-produced books in the US, and a really compelling story, I think, both of textile communication, but also the textile in a quite violent and damaging sense. And I know this sort of makes me sound like I'm a grumpy person, when I think we also need to talk about the ways that textiles can be used to break communities, to ostracize, to mark, as well as maybe the slightly more popular discourse at the moment, which is all the ways that textiles contribute to community building. I'm not interested in denying that. But I've also written sometimes about the smallness of craft. I wonder if we do need to also be responsible sometimes for some of the other counter narratives that exist, and not to get too romanticized about this, which is where a lot of my examples today are going to dwell, maybe on the fact that this labor can be highly, highly oppressive, although some examples turn that around into a rather remarkable form of empowerment inside that oppression. So for those of you not so familiar with the narrative, we are never told what the letter A explicitly stands for, but our main character is required by her community to stitch this red letter and to wear it at all times. She gives birth to a child, and her husband has been away. And so, of course, there is a very common reading that the A is a punishment for adultery, or a branding of adultery, but that's never explicitly said in the narrative. And one of the things that I think for a literary textile person is so fascinating is the way she owns that embroidery and stitches it and makes it into her punishment into a thing of very considerable beauty. So we're introduced early on when the young woman, the mother of this child, stood fully revealed before the crowd. It seemed to be her first impulse to clasp the infant closely to her bosom, not so much by an impulse of motherly affection as that she might thereby conceal a certain token which was wrought or fastened to her dress. In a moment, however, wisely judging that one token of her shame would but poorly serve to hide another, she took the baby on her arm, and with a burning blush and yet a haughty smile and a glance that would not be abashed, looked around at her townspeople and her neighbors. It's impossible for her to hide, and she doesn't want to hide this child that she has, who is also described as a rather magical creature of her own, of a certain beauty that seems to come with their terrible punishment that the community has decided for them. And then we have the textile itself. So we have this sort of radiating child who seems to have this almost otherworldly power to her. And then the mother's punishment, if we are going to read it as that, which she twists around in the beauty of her own embroidery. On the breast of her gown, in fine red cloth, surrounded an elaborate embroidery and fantastic flourishes of gold thread, appeared the letter A. It was so artistically done, and with so much fertility and gorgeous luxuriance of fancy, that it had all the effect of a lasting and fitting decoration to the apparel which she wore, and which was of a splendor in accordance with the taste of the age, but greatly beyond what was allowed by the sumptuary regulations of the colony. So this is an extreme Puritan setting, a very, very limited in all regards of pleasure of any kind, bodily pleasure or aesthetic pleasure. And so the fact that the meaning of this letter and how she controls it sort of hangs for the reader has always compelled me. There is, of course, our narrator's wonderful humor when there is a suggestion that it is actually one of the religious men of the community who seems to be burdened by a particularly acute atmosphere of guilt around him. And our narrator points out, had Hester sinned alone? As we all know, this is conceiving her child was not actually something she would have done by herself. But the part of this story that I'm also interested in is the thing that I think we do spend a lot less time dwelling on, the textile as a way to divide people rather than unite people. It didn't entirely work because of the way that this character chose to twist her punishment around and almost turn it back as a reflection on the community. But I include this in the textile reader on the section about community, but in a rather backwards way, that community can also be about a lot of energy and actions to divide, not necessarily always bring together. And I suppose I called this Rehearsing Our Futures maybe as a little bit of a warning that as we embark on textile scholarship, or whatever we want to call literary scholarship that attends to the textile, that we're not always over romanticizing that the textile is always a point of positive, because it gets used in really toxic ways as well. I'll get to something a bit more cheerful at the end. I apologize. I know it always sounds like I'm the doom and gloom storyteller. I had said that I would look at the arpilleras in my abstract, and I must admit, I then came across a New York exhibition of this Brazilian artist who I had written about an incredibly long time ago when the work was exhibited at the Victoria and Albert. And so I've switched this example out only because this question about our textile labor, or a person's textile labor, being a place of empowerment or of oppression, I think has a really fascinating reading here. So this was a recent New York exhibition, and Arcebispo de Rosario is considered by some to have been, to use a very disrespectful and old-fashioned term now, an outsider artist. What I can say is that he was self-trained. He had a rather eclectic life of his own. He served in the Navy, the Marines. He was a professional boxer for a time. And he also had experienced a vision, a visitation, which told him that he needed to prepare for the second coming of Christ through a documentation of all of the world around him, that this was his task. And so these large cloths become this incredible archive of, it's a little bit hard for you to see probably on the right, but those are a lot of different types of military ships, or different names, different pieces from the alphabet, an absolute compulsion to make, which was guided by an influence he described as being outside of him. He was at different moments of his life in and out of different psychiatric institutions, not of his own choice. But there's also a sense that maybe this work, a little bit like the prison work I alluded to being newly interested in earlier, what is driving what? Did the compression of that environment drive him to do this work, or actually is it the other way around? Is it a place of enormous empowerment inside the confines of an institution where somebody has lost their own freedom? What drove him to make? He has been recorded in many different places as explaining that this came as a very, very strong voices, very, very strong instructions from outside himself. This is in an interview before he passed away, being asked about rest and sleep, and he said that he doesn't sleep very much, very, very little, because I go to bed and I listen to voices. Have you done that? Have you done this? Have you done that other thing? Tomorrow I want you to do this. I want you to do that. And so this is how I spend the night. I bring this example in because it's another, in some ways, ostracization from the community, just like our Scarlet Letter example, but also maybe another, without being naive about the incredible difficulties that he lived in the institutions that he was held in, nonetheless, another way of turning that experience around and also finding a remarkable outlet within it. So these are, I showed you that first slide to hopefully give you a tiny sense of the scale. So really large dictionary names rather of the letter A, the front, and then this is the back. So by coincidence, another letter A, but an exhaustive cataloging of the world, which was to be the required preparation for a religious visitation he believed would be coming. He also created garments for himself to wear, wrapped objects, collections of all sorts of things, always from within the confines of where he was. So this is often the blue thread here, I understand, comes from the unraveling of the blue sheeting and the textiles that were available to him. In other works, it's flip-flops, sandals, spoons, all sorts of a cataloging exercise. So if Hawthorne's character was forced by her community into a certain type of pressure of a punishment through a certain identity, this is another type of cataloging that the person takes and twists around in another way. They're stitched onto sheets, so that might also give you a little bit of a better sense of the bed sheets is the scale. And I found this to be a really evocative quote as well, I suppose. Spending more time in the archive myself recently, and this idea of how we control and how we catalog and categorize information and knowledge, and of course with that people who have made different decisions about their lives, or if we go back to the Scarlet Letter again, maybe did or did not have a decision in that action, but chose to react to circumstances differently. After all, museums are themselves a totalizing project, conceived during the Enlightenment with the encyclopedic goal of collecting and classifying all of nature and culture. And this was the task that de Rosario believed he had been asked to do. You must catalog everything. This is to be ready. First we must grab a record of it all. In this sense, Bispo de Rosario's textiles and sculptures are not works created from the perspective of an outsider, but the inventions of someone working so deeply within the obsessions which have driven the project of civilization that they may reveal the madness which has torn open the seams of the cultural fabric. Now, it's not an uncommon observation to point out that a lot of work that previously was classified as outsider art or comes from perspectives that weren't within the conventions of artistic education or actually the artistic economy of how things are consumed, often sort of has an insight to it that is far more accurate than what the machine produces. But I keep this in mind as I look to the speculative and the science fiction that I was reading at the end of this, because of this idea of a little bit of a warning that these stories that seem arbitrary or seem as though they are driven by something that is sort of beyond a particularly rational logic might actually have quite a lot going on that is exactly the opposite of that. So the idea of the textile having any place at all in science fiction or in speculative fiction maybe already seems like a little bit of an oddity or a forward anachronism. If we think about craft and how people often try to connect it to heritage and tradition and the past, then it seems a rather odd thing in some ways to evoke. But as I was working on this, I stumbled across this example that I could not stop myself from sharing with you. So this is a little deviation, I have to admit, a deviation inside what is already eclectic. But this is Matabele Gittinger's research from quite some time ago. A textile that is held in the Textile Museum in Washington, D.C., probably made around the 1930s. It is batik, the type of cloth I was telling you I've been interested in for some time now. Etymological traces of the word batik do connect it to writing. So batik is about drawing wax on cloth, and there are, of course, conflicting ideas about what languages this comes from and if it actually means writing on cloth or drawing on cloth. But there's certainly, for our purposes, in some historians' mind, is a very real connection to the drawing, the hand drawing of the wax, which is what we're looking at in this type of particularly historical example, as a form, a drawing, a writing form. So this is a particularly fine piece of design as far as the quality and the control. Batik is something that requires a person to think in reverse because it is a resist technique. And so you are not laying color onto the cloth, but with usually with wax. There are other pastes, but usually with wax, you are protecting pieces of the cloth from dye as you layer up the color over time. So it requires a completely inverted thinking. You're not putting down first what you want, you're holding that there. So it is the last thing to have the dye touch it and be exposed. But this is extremely unusually an example of an Indonesian batik that is inspired by a 1930s comic strip. And the comic strip was extremely popular, Flash Gordon. It was translated into many languages, and so it is very conceivable that it's somehow, not necessarily in newspaper form, but maybe in some type of compilation form, would have been on the island of Java around this time. Gittinger's research shows that the characters are uncannily similar, and the configuration very, very similar. And it was widely distributed. Apparently, the strip opens in the mid-30s with the end of the world, as these things often do, because a planet was rushing on a collision course towards Earth. And we have the works of a scientist, Zarkov, who's going to save the world. And Flash Gordon, conveniently a Yale graduate and world-renowned polo player, really quite a hunk in the comic strips. And Dale Arden, passengers on an airplane hit by the meteor. This is going to be what knocks things off course. And then they continue on another planet, which is rather tropical in its landscape, coincidentally, and are constantly battling, of course, the forces of evil as they try to reinstall good in the world. So curiously, the batik artist, who is unfortunately not known, it is still at this point, I understand, anonymous, whose work this would have been. But Flash Gordon, you can see him here now. He gets a good bit more clothing in her batiks, sort of a discretion to the culture of the making. That the batik patterning, he has his little what would we call them, little shorts on, but he also has a patterning that fits over his whole entire body, so they're not anywhere near as naked as our comic strips were. Also, the female characters and that interaction isn't what's transferred onto the batik. We also have I think quite a racist stereotype, very reflective of the time that it was made. This is our evil character, Ming the Merciless. Gittinger acknowledges that in the batik, this becomes a torso and a head. It doesn't ever become a whole body, but Ming reappears across the batik surface as well. And then, of course, we have to have our spaceships and our various different types of aerials. And so the idea that the future and these rather futuristic reaches aren't present in historical textiles is a real anathema. They're alive and well, at least. This is a very curious and odd example, but I couldn't resist adding it, only also because of a reflection of the time. So this is made in the 30s. And the sort of this, I think we tend to look particularly at these types of textile traditions and take them to be quite fixed in a particular type of past, rather than a sort of a very, very changing, even in the 1930s, sense of content. So I use that to set the stage for the examples that I have that do come from science fiction now. The first is the hair carpet weavers. Hair carpet weavers it was written in German, and it now, of course, has a English language translation, but hence I can read it. And it is a real story of textile labor being a form of oppression to keep the masses as busy and as tied up in their work as possible. It's got a number of really curious inversions to it as well. The premise of the societal structure is that in a man's life, they need to complete the weaving of one hair carpet. the hair comes from their wives in the plural, collected from their hairbrush, nothing too violent about it, collected hair by hair from their hairbrushes each day. And of course, this means that it would be useful to have both multiple wives and wives with multiple hair colors to help you with your design. So it's not exactly a feminist masterpiece here. But some of the inversions that are really, I think, quite striking are that we have a situation where the weaving of a hair carpet can only sustain one family. And so rather than a tradition of femicide, the families are obliged to kill every son that is born after their firstborn son, because the men are the weavers and there can only be one weaver in the family. And the outcome of the life's work to make the hair carpet is that it is then sold, essentially a type of sort of sale, but tax, to an emperor on another planet. And they must, this is their life tax. It must be produced, and when it is produced, it triggers the start of the next generation working on their hair carpet. And of course, everybody's so busy doing this that they haven't taken any time. They're not able to notice what has been happening on any of the other planets. A truly, truly bizarre story, which has these pretty gruesome descriptions of the detail of the labor that is being undertaken. So the fineness of the thread, the human hair that is being used, and the damage that this is doing to all of their bodies over time. Knot after knot, day in, day out, for an entire lifetime. Always the same hand movements, always looping the same knots in the fine hair, so fine and so tiny that with time, the fingers trembled and the eyes became weak from strain. And still the progress was hardly noticeable. On a day he made good headway, there was a new piece of his carpet, perhaps as big as his fingernail. So this is a different type of compulsion in a way. In this setting, it is another type of higher power. So if Bispo de Rosario believed that he had been called upon to catalogue the world, and it compelled him to this really quite frenetic type of making that went on for his whole entire life. This is another type of compulsion in a way, although it is also the empire that has created this requirement and this compulsion. So he squatted before the creaking carpet frame where his father and his father before him had sat, each with the same stooped posture and with the old filmy magnifying lens before his eyes, his arms propped against the worn breastboard, moving the knotting needle with only the tips of his fingers. Unfortunately, we do very much know of both bodily damage and absolutely eyesight damage, often with child weavers in contexts where there is not enough labor control, and children being asked to do very, very fine textile work because of the dexterity, but also the size of their fingers. So this takes a lot of these realities and packages them into this completely bizarre story. But unfortunately, it's not really that bizarre when you break it down into certain details. This idea of being completely locked into a form of labor that is also oppressing a whole entire planet in this case, or multiple planets, because it's science fiction, we can get really, really quite big. There's a ceremony annually for those who have finished their hair carpets, when the transaction, it is a purchase price, which then basically finances in a very limited way subsistence for the family through the whole entire next generation until the next carpet is released. But the idea is that this is all the demand of an emperor, that nobody, at least on this planet has ever met. So 12 of the carpets were present in person, old bowed men who were able to stand only with difficulty and who glanced around with half-blind eyes. Citizens, cast your eyes on the carpets that will beautify the palace of the emperor. So you shall receive the work of your fathers and become indebted to them. Cutting the carpet from the frame was a symbolic act, closing out a life's work. And of course, one of the subtexts of this story is that the debt is far, far more than an economic debt. This is about a type of economic oppression, which is keeping people perversely busy and yes, absolutely indentured, you could say in a way, and in debt. But it is also the guilt of the knowledge of all of the male children who have been killed by the family in order to sustain the one male weaver of the family. And this is about another type of power being held over the worker. At the end of the story, we are in the archive, in a future situation, and another group of people are trying to piece together this history. And they are a little bit, as the quote about Bispo de Rosario said, the encyclopedic knowledge of cataloging the world. Now we're in an archive. A council has been called to try and understand why these carpets had ever been made or what it was about. There is an archivist who is being overlooked by the council because of his age, who has all of the information to hand. People do live a strangely long time in these stories, so they're more than what we would think of as a generation. But this is also, I think, entirely about loss of human ability to communicate with each other and enormous knowledge gaps that then meet, in this case, the different planets. But also this collecting and cataloging of information that humans over time manage to miss the point of how they continue to access it. So the languages change, or the database systems, or the archiving systems that are holding all of this history aren't known to other people. So now we just have a volume of information and no entry points back into it. All of the stories, all of the explanations that some people do know have been lost. So there must be other, easier solutions, not all this, the rituals are nothing, but the merciful gifts of our emperor to us. They are his means of helping us, of preventing us from becoming lost to him and running headlong to our destruction. That is the sole purpose. With every hair the carpet maker picks up and knots, he is thinking, I belong to the emperor. The problem is that there is no emperor. There hasn't been an emperor for a very long time, and the hair carpets have actually conveniently, they get shipped out through some type of cunning little time tunnel and dumped on another planet as part of a horrible story of retribution, where a previous agreement was that the hair would carpet the entire planet. And so it's about human greed and human ability to punish each other. But the part when we are rehearsing our futures, if I go back to that title that I want to dwell on, is this breakdown of knowledge. And people are continuing the repetition of their work, and they've actually lost the whole reason for how it might have started. Or in this case, the planets that are continuing to weave the hair carpets desperately cannot let go of the idea that they need to continue this work. So there is a exploratory ship that defies regulations and lands and tries to spread this word that the emperor is long gone and this labor is not needed. And these people have been to the palace and there are no hair carpets in the palace, and it's very difficult to, nobody wants to pick up on that story, because the gaps in the planets talking to each other have gone on for so long, that there are too many broken broken stories in the mix. And I think that although this looks as though it's truly a bizarre story, certainly my mother would say it's a very bizarre story, Jessica, and you don't really need to work with these things. I read sentences like this, and I think this is not science fiction. You know, in small ways, this is also does get itself attached to craft practices continuing today. If I die without completing a carpet, my life will have had no purpose. So our main male character at the end of the story, his wives are imploring him to stop. It is broadly known by the community that there is no emperor and this work is not needed. And he can't detach himself from this being his purpose and his identity. Because the mechanism of the oppression that it had created in the society is strong enough that people are not so willing to walk away from it. And then the second component, which is the perversity of the scale that they're working on, doesn't really give them time to step back and wonder what they're doing. If you're not a weaver, the rest of the community is compelled to support the weavers. So it basically sort of paralyzes everyone together. And I promised that I would not take us totally into doom and gloom. So bear with me. This is my final example, because I don't think that these things are always negative. Actually, I have to work pretty hard to find these strange, dark examples. But I like to balance them together, because I think that we are responsible for creating a much more whole or complete picture of what textile labor really is about. So Ursula Le Guin, maybe a familiar writer to some of you, really remarkable storyteller. And this is a compilation of writing, a rather large book. It's set sort of possibly in a bit of a place that's a bit like California, possibly, but in a future which, although this is a much more positive story, it still has the problem that it is in a future where groups of people have become distant from each other, and knowledge is archived and collected, and the mechanisms, the tools, the languages, the codes, the databases for unlocking the archive are forgotten, have been lost or have not been passed down. So there's an amassing of stuff that nobody can continue to learn from. So the trouble with the Cotton People is a short story. It was also published separately, but it's in all the long experimental book I just showed you the cover of, Always Coming Home. And it's about trade between two groups of people and the problems that they're having, the cloth art people and the wine art people. And Le Guin sort of masquerades almost a little bit as a type of anthropologist to these future societies, describing the people that she meets, and the problems that they're facing, and the differences that they meet along the way. So it's another, of course, compelling example of, it might look like it's far in the future, but of course many of her messages are rather haunting as far as their prescience for today. So the big beef between the cotton, the cloth people and the wine people is that the wine people are continuing their quite high quality wine production, and they know that the cloth people in the South have a particular taste, often for some of their sweeter wines. They're continuing in good conscience to ship down to them the wines that they know are best. What they are receiving in return is becoming lower and lower in quality. So the people who had bought the cotton said that they were just middlemen. They hadn't seen the lousy cotton. They just loaded it and unloaded it. So these are the transport people in the middle. The only person there, they said, who was actually from the cotton people, wasn't able to speak any language anybody else spoke. Soaring, that's the name of one of the characters, dragged himself over to the said exchange, but he acted as if he had never heard of TOC. This is meant to be their joining language. And when she tried to get a message through to the exchange, to the place of the cotton, where the place of the cotton came from, nobody answered. So we have a communication breakdown along that coast, and we have a trade agreement which has been stable for a long time, but now the wine people feel basically like they are being taken for a ride, that they're getting much lower quality materials in return for what they are continuing to send as what they feel is the original agreement of good quality materials. They decide that the only thing that can be done is they have to go and meet these people. And it takes a long time. It's a complex journey. The coastline has eroded. It's much more difficult to get down there. And then a long council ensues, which starts with a lot of blustering and disagreement and broken forms of communication and shame and embarrassment and guilt, and then slowly over time builds back their communication. And the ending of the story recognizes that the cotton people are the cloth people, the quality of the cotton that they're sending is so poor because they are suffering so much from climate change. So their fields have become saline. They're having a real problem growing their cotton crops. There are pests that have damaged crops, and they are suffering in the landscape that they are living in, and they didn't know how to announce that or explain what the problem was. And the reason why I want to end on this, I also actually end the textile reader with it as well, because it just seems like the most beautiful warning and lesson about miscommunication and maybe after all these COVID years that we've had, the importance to also continue to try and see through miscommunication by dialogue, by understanding, you know, what is really going on here, because the explanations, once they're exposed to each other, make a lot of sense. And the ending of the story leaves us with this comment. This is from the wine people. They were not unreasonable people, except for making little paths everywhere. The wine people are bemused by their living, their societal structures, and so the landscape is different, and so they wish they didn't make so many paths. But they are not unreasonable, except for making little paths everywhere and being ashamed to admit that they have had troubles. So I leave you with that, and I'm very open to taking questions. But I think a subtext of a warning that these stories have, which might not be so extreme or so fictional as some of the packaging around them would often present us with. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jessica, and thank you. It was really interesting to really thank you, and to open up the conference with this idea of the counter narratives that we might have around textiles and textile labors and different ways to think about not just the community making in a positive way, but from the perspective of oppression. Thank you. And I having a sort of look at the time. I know that in theory it would be the time of the break now. So what I would suggest is that we keep like a couple of questions now, then we still have a short break before the first panel, and then perhaps in the Q&A that we have 45 minutes after the first panel.
Absolutely.
If there are still questions that perhaps are weaving together with the papers that we'll listen later on, we can do that. So I'd rather leave the space to other people. If there are comments or questions, please feel free to just unmute yourself and ask to Jessica.
And as I said, I'm very, very happy to pick up the conversation over the next 2 days as well. I'm the first to admit that I don't usually come up with my questions until the middle of the night of the week after the conference. So no pressure there. There is certainly time to come back to things.
Yeah, I imagine that that's the case also, especially when there's lots of thinking that sparks after hearing such a brilliant keynote. Perhaps I'll just break the ice, if that's all right, and then we'll go for the break. I've been very interested from a sort of poetic theory perspective on the element of repetition, and you've also mentioned repetition, and of course, then I was very interested to see how repetition works when there's both the sort of poetic bit and the textiles involved, and I was amazed by the works of Arthur Bispo de Rosario that you shown, and of course I can think of, without being familiar, but just with the things that you've shown, I can think of various ways of repetition working out there. But I was just curious about the specifics of the texts, and if there are forms of like actual repetitions in the words, or like is this archive kind of this accumulation of this mobile archive, is it
in his works
through the element of repetition, or
my understanding, I don't read Portuguese, but my understanding is that it's rather than exact repetition, it tends to be about categories and groupings, which I suppose is also a type of repetition and rhythm. Yes, so I know it wasn't so easy for you maybe to see, but as I said, sort of the drawings of what I understand are maybe all the different types of ships that the Navy has, or another, or the names that were the letter A, and so a constant shifting as well, which is maybe a little bit different than the labor repetition in the hair carpets weavers, which I'm nervous to say exactly what it is that author thought they were making, because we have weavers in the audience here, they actually talk about a hook as though it may be some type of latch hook structure, and I spoiled the story for everyone, and at the end he accidentally rips the cloth, and it's about a backing cloth. So so weaving, maybe for literal weavers, it's a little bit something else that's going on there, but I think they do all have even the cotton, the trouble with the cotton people, that is often about this language block as well, which I think is a very good thing to think about, that now we have this accumulation. Many of these stories coincidentally refer to an archive, or refer to that humanity has remembered to some form of collecting its past knowledge, but it forgot the key. And the key is often language. No, maybe I shouldn't say that. It's a lot of different. So the volume exists, but the entry points have been completely forgotten. Yeah. Which I think is I think that's a very fair warning for all of us to think about.
Absolutely. Thank you.